Hello. We are in Exodus chapter 7. You are making some extreme progress. You have probably studied the Bible closer than about 80%, maybe even higher, of everyone. Because most people hear the Bible, but they don't actually read it or study it directly. So that's kind of how we ended up where we are. We didn't know what God really wanted, so we did things that we thought God wanted, or maybe we just wanted. So that's why we go to the Word, find out what He really meant. So today we are in Exodus chapter 7. This is where Aaron's staff becomes a serpent. It is also where some of the things that maybe you've learned or believed or heard are not actually the way it worked, or maybe not complete. If you've seen Charlton Heston in the Ten Commandments, I think that's what it's called. That is a movie. There was a script. There's dramatic license used, and it's a good movie. I like it, but they had to make it more interesting to the movie part. So it's not biblically accurate in a lot of ways. So you might hear something and you're like, well, I didn't think that's the way it was. It's because you may have learned the wrong way. I'm not saying you're wrong or your pastor's wrong. I'm just saying, let's read the word and then we'll look. So, chapter 7 of Exodus. I'm reading from the Complete Jewish Bible because, once again, it really matters about the translation. So, chapter 7, verse 1. But Adonai said to Moshe, I have put you in place of God to Pharaoh, and Aaron your brother will be your prophet. You are to say everything I order you, and Aaron your brother is to speak to Pharaoh and tell him to let the people of Israel leave his land. But I will make him hard-hearted, even though I will increase my signs and wonders in the land of Egypt. Pharaoh will not listen to you. Then I will lay my hand on Egypt and bring my armies, my people, the sons of Israel, out of the land of Egypt with great acts of judgment. Then, when I stretch out my hand over Egypt and bring the people of Israel out among them, the Egyptians will know that I am Adonai. That's one of the reasons he's doing it, not just to save the Israelites, but to show Egypt, the Egyptians, who he really is. So Moshe and Aaron did exactly what Adonai ordered them to do. Moshe was 80 years old and Aaron was 83 when they spoke to Pharaoh. Excuse me. Adonai said to Moshe and Aaron, when Pharaoh says to you, excuse me, perform a miracle, tell Aaron to take his staff and throw it down in front of Pharaoh so that it can become a snake. Moshe and Aaron went into Pharaoh and did this as Adonai had ordered. Aaron threw down his staff in front of Pharaoh and his servants, and it turned into a snake. But Pharaoh, in turn, called for the sages and sorcerers, and they too, the Egyptians of Egypt, did the same thing, making use of their secret arts. Each one threw his staff down, and they turned into snakes. But Aaron's staff swallowed up theirs. Nevertheless, Pharaoh was made hard-hearted, and he didn't listen to them, as Adonai said would happen. That's another thing. Sometimes we're like, how can I convince them? How could they believe something so clearly delusional? Well, once your heart's hardened to believing in anything God says, makes it really easy to believe anything the world says. That's why you got to plug back into the word every day. So Adonai said to Moshe, Pharaoh is stubborn. He refuses to let the people go. Go to Pharaoh in the morning, and when he goes out to the water, stand on the riverbank to confront him. Take in your hand the staff which was turned into a snake, and say to him, Adonai, the God of the Hebrews, sent me to you and to say, let my people go so that they can worship me in the desert. But until now you haven't listened. So Adonai says, this will let you know that I am Adonai. I will take the staff in my hand and strike the water in the river, and it will be turned into blood. The fish in the river will die, and the river will stink, and the Egyptians won't want to drink water from the river. Adonai said to Moshe, say to Aaron, take your staff, reach out your hand over the waters of Egypt, over the rivers, canals, ponds, and all the reservoir, so that they can turn into blood. There will be blood throughout the whole land of Egypt, even in the wooden buckets and stone jars. Moshe and Aaron did exactly what Adonai had ordered. He raised the staff, and in the sight of Pharaoh and his servants, struck the water in the river, and all the water in the river was turned into blood. The fish in the river died, and the river bank stank so badly that the Egyptians couldn't drink its water. There was blood throughout all the land of Egypt, but the magicians of Egypt did the same with their secret arts. So the Pharaoh was made hard-hearted and didn't listen to them, as Adonai had said would happen. Pharaoh just turned and went back to his palace without taking any of this to his heart. All the Egyptians dug around the river for water to drink because they couldn't drink the river water. 7 days after Adonai had struck the river, Adonai said to Moshe, "Go into Pharaoh and say to him, 'Here is what Adonai says. Let my people go so they can worship me. If you refuse to let them go, I will strike all your territory with frogs. The river will swarm with frogs. They will go up, enter your palace, and go into your bedroom and onto your bed. They will enter the houses of your servants, and your people will go in, and go into your ovens and kneading bowls. The frogs will climb all over you, your people and your servants.'" So most of us have either heard or read some version of that at some point in our lives. The question is, did we see the details, the things that are really, really important to notice about the Nile turning into blood? That's where we learn. That's where we grow. So there's only two mediators in Scripture. I think I said this earlier, that Moses and Jesus. The Father put Moses, the mediator, in the role of a divine being, God, with Aaron being the spokesman for the divine. And this is important. So that's the same pattern with Christ. Yeshua is in the role of divine God, and he's a prophet like Aaron, and to pave the way, to speak, he is the word. But then also, like Aaron, he has John the Baptist who is paving the way for him. He's speaking for him. And some people say, well, how do we see all of that? The only way to see a lot of that, I think, is you have to go through the whole Bible. You have to read the Old Testament to see all these patterns. And then you'll see Christ do the exact same thing. And that's how you know the Old Testament points towards Christ. We have the advantage of knowing who Christ is. They didn't. They had to look for him. So seeing John the Baptist leading the way and remembering that's kind of how Aaron did it, maybe we should look at it that way. So Pharaoh was considered divine, and now Moses would be the divine negotiator. So he considered himself a god, and now Moses is basically his equal, negotiating with him. And remember, one of the reasons he didn't want to let all these Hebrews go is because that was the workforce. All of Egypt's workforce would be leaving the country. That's a really big deal. Imagine if we lost like 75 million people, all the plumbers, electricians, the crafts people, welders, the people that really work hard. That would be devastating, not only to us personally, but also our economy would just tank. But that's another pattern. That's another lesson. God is showing us that following God will cause some pain, some discomfort. But whatever it is will be less than our refusal. The refusal to be obedient to God always, well, not always, but sometimes in the moment seems better than following God. But what God's trying to show us and teach us all throughout the Bible is your refusal and my refusal will always be worse. The consequences will always be worse in not following God than following, even if it looks better. That's just what God teaches us. So first, the Hebrew for plague is nagah. And nagah is more of a generic word that really means to be struck, some kind of blow, with the idea of a punishment, like a spanking, it's to hit somebody. So I really like the word stroke rather than plagues, because I think it just fits what God was doing. He was striking the Egyptians and Hebrews in some ways, but also there were only 9 strokes. We talk about the 10 plagues of Egypt, but actually there were only 9 strokes or plagues. The 10th one was a judgment, and God tells us that. I'm doing these 3 sets of 3, and then the final one is a judgment. Once we get there, all bets are off. You don't have time to change your mind anymore. It's just like us. He's telling us once we get to that final judgment, negotiating is over. There's no reason for you to wait that long, but if you do, you may wait past your time of waiting. So the first 9 were there to convince Pharaoh to avoid the judgment, the 10th one. And God, by his own hand, would kill the firstborn of all of Egypt. That will be the judgment. That's how they will know those previous 9 strokes were all pointing towards this one judgment. So these strokes were 3 sets of 3. The first 3 all involved the land of Egypt. And Egyptians, Hebrews, visitors, everyone in the land was affected. They were generally mild, but they were all affected by those first 3. And then the next 2 sets of 3 impacted only the Egyptians. So the first 3 impacted everybody in the land, no matter who you were. The next 2 sets of 3 only affected the Egyptians. So God divided and separated his people away in the middle of these strokes, these plagues. So imagine how the news spread. These people are suffering. It's our land and we're suffering, but those hated Hebrews are not. How are they being held away from whatever we're struggling with? So the first stroke lasted 7 days. The first plague to the final judgment was 10 months. I don't know if anybody's ever said that to you, but I never knew how long the plagues lasted. I assumed they lasted, really quickly. That was one right after the other, but it actually took 10 months in total. So what that teaches us is Pharaoh had time to repent. He had time to turn from his view and his actions. So in between each stroke, the people would gain this false hope and life would move back to normal. And they're like, oh, okay, fine. We don't really have to worry about that now. If you were in the United States right after the pandemic started, constantly we heard, we got to do this to get back to normal. All we wanted to do was get back to normal. And now 3 or 4 years later, we realize normal's not coming back. It's never happening again. After 9/11, churches were just overflowing. Everybody went to church. And then after a period of time, we decided to just focus on the security at the airport and go back to what we were doing and live the way we lived prior to 9/11. People really haven't changed that much in 3,500 years. It pretty much is the same. We're all, human nature is, we want to go back to whatever we were comfortable with. So the third stroke of each group, too, came unannounced to Pharaoh. Moses didn't tell him first. He told him the first 2, and then he said, if you don't do anything, a third one's going to happen, but I'm not going to tell you when or how or any of that stuff. So 2 strokes would occur after Moses warned Pharaoh. Then a third, stronger one would happen, the last of the set of 3. So to Pharaoh, Aaron and Moses were responsible for the strokes. Because remember, he can't see God. He might believe he exists, but all he sees is Moses and Aaron. So God uses that third of each set to show that Jehovah was the author of these things. The reason Moses doesn't announce them or give any kind of warning is because God wants him to see this was outside of Moses and Aaron. Something bigger is controlling this, and it's God. So understanding that point is huge in what's coming, because he was supreme over all things, everywhere, even Egypt. Even though he was considered the Canaanite God or the Hebrew God, he's now showing him, that the Pharaoh, that he has power everywhere. God wanted Egypt to be made aware of his power and glory. That was the purpose of it. So they would give up all their false gods and worship Yahweh. God made a way for them to join the Israelites as they left. So the reason was he wanted them to do it too. He wants all of us to follow him. So Pharaoh believed that Yahweh was a real God and powerful. He also let Israel go eventually. But does that mean that Pharaoh actually was righteous before God? No, he just gave in. He believed, but he didn't trust God. These 2 men, Moses and Aaron, are 80 and 83. They go back to Pharaoh, and Moses' staff becomes a serpent. Then the serpent was the Egyptian symbol of fertility and authority. Not fertility, but authority and healing. And so it was an insult to Pharaoh's authority because he grabbed this image and held it. So through Satan's power to counterfeit, which he does have real power, Satan's not fake. He has the power to counterfeit miracles and different things. The Pharaoh's sorcerers and stuff were able to copy the miracle. But notice that God's power overwhelmed them, and Moses' snake ate the other ones. So God let them do it, but then he showed them, I have power over your fake power, your false power. So Moses pronounces the coming of the first stroke, and the Nile turns to blood red. Not just the river, but the canals, the reservoirs. This affected everyone. All water that came from the Nile, even if it was in a barrel 10 miles away, became blood red. So it all turned to blood. The cooking pot, storage container, anything taken out of the Nile to store water was turned into blood. So now what we need to know is every year at this time, the rise of the Nile, the silt that comes up would color the water red. And the nutrients in the silt spurred the growth of microorganisms that would affect something called a red tide. Now in Corpus Christi, Texas, I live in South Texas, we have something called the red tide. And it burns your eyes. It's a natural occurrence. Everything God uses is naturally occurring, except he takes it to a much higher level. So the Nile normally turned red and had the red tide, but water you took out of it last week or yesterday didn't turn red. That was already out of the river. This time it did. God was showing his power. This was something they would recognize as fairly normal, but it was never at this scale. So the Hebrew word is dam, which means blood or blood-like. So verse 24 says, everyone had to dig around the Nile for water to drink. So one of the big questions is, did the water really turn to blood, or did it turn blood-like and just red? Well, they had to dig a hole in the sand because the hole would filter the water when it filled with water. And the sand would filter those particles out. Same way we do it now with osmosis and all the different things. The pollutants could be filtered out using the sand. So if they were able to filter the water to drink it, there's no way it was really blood, because you can't filter blood to get water out of it. I mean, I know the blood bank would disagree with me, but technically they didn't have that technology. So no amount of filtering would have made blood drinkable. So 7 days with no water in Egypt too is a death sentence. I mean, you know, I've had my kids spend 3 hours in the house and say they were going to die of thirst because they didn't turn the water faucet on and we didn't have a bottle of water. That's not what happens here. This is the desert. This is Egypt. You're not going to walk around Egypt with no water for a couple of days, much less 7. So that was not the aim, especially since the Hebrews were subjected to it too. He wouldn't have caused the Hebrews to die. So it's important to know who's affected by which plague or stroke, because that matters as to the depth of it and what the purpose of it is. So that's Exodus 7. I hope I didn't upset too many people, but I hope also you saw something that maybe you didn't see before. So share this with somebody else and say, hey, have you ever read Exodus 7? It's pretty interesting. Let's talk about it. Remember, love God, love people, and change the world.